Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the strange and curious sides of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and on this special episode for spooky season, I'll be talking to you about witches. When you hear the word witch, what image comes into your mind? Most people immediately think of an old woman in a black pointy hat. Well, the hat comes from Victorian greeting cards. But it's true that most people historically accused of witchcraft were women. Though men were accused as well, some estimates say that about a fifth of those tried for witchcraft were male. And while those women accused did tend to be older widows or spinsters, that's maybe because they were more easily singled out. Because the thing most of the people accused of witchcraft had in common was that they were outcasts. Maybe they lived alone, or maybe they were considered to be disrespectful of authority, or maybe they had a disability, or anything that set them apart. The one thing they weren't, in all but a handful of cases, was Irish. Let's start by talking a bit about witch trials in general. While the idea of witches goes back to biblical times, it was during the medieval and Renaissance periods in Europe that witch trials really became a major thing. They started in the 14th century and continued all the way up until the 19th, with thousands of people being tried and often executed for witchcraft. Being accused wasn't a guaranteed death sentence, though. The most bloodthirsty parts of Europe were Switzerland and Germany, or rather, the area that is modern Germany. For a lot of this time, it was a collection of smaller countries like Bavaria and Prussia. In this area, over 16,000 people were accused of witchcraft. Of these, around 7,000 were killed. Switzerland had lower numbers, but the highest death rate in Europe. Nearly 6,000 dead out of 10,000 accused. It was the only country in Europe where the death rate was above 50%, and most other countries had a much lower number of deaths. The reason for this low conviction rate is one of the most important things to remember about the witch trials. They were actual trials. Aside from some periods of mass hysteria and witch crazes, legal processes were followed. What legal processes were in place had a major impact on how witch trials happened in a country. For example, just look at Scotland and England. In England, over most of this period, evidence gained under torture was not legally admissible, and witchcraft cases were tried at an assize, a circuit court held by a senior judge for more serious crimes. In Scotland, these cases were tried by the local courts. This meant that local judges, who often had their own opinions and prejudices, were in charge. More importantly, Scotland kept torture as part of the legal process far longer than England. This meant that confessions were more easily obtained, though a lot less trustworthy. It also meant that one accusation could quickly snowball into many more, often directed by the suggestions of the torturers. With all this, it's not surprising that despite its smaller population, Scotland had around 3 times as many trials as England did, and a much higher conviction rate. Ireland, as I mentioned, was an anomaly. It had the same legal system as England. For almost all of this period, it also had around the same population as England. It wasn't until the Great Famine tilted one end of the scale down and the Industrial Revolution tilted the other end up that England became far more populated than Ireland. But despite these similarities, they were very different in terms of witch trials. England had around 1,200 people put on trial for witchcraft. Ireland had less than 20. That's a massive difference, and worth trying to understand. One important clue is that almost all of these trials didn't involve Irish people. In most cases, both the accuser and the accused were ethnically English or Scottish people living in Ireland. There are a bunch of theories why the Irish weren't involved. One is that we were more accepting of folk beliefs, but I don't think that's much of a factor. The idea that witches were all people who followed the old ways or were part of a suppressed pagan religion has been fairly thoroughly debunked. That idea was popularized in the 1920s and 30s by the anthropologist Margaret Murray. It was a good theory, since it made people look at their assumptions and ultimately led to a more comprehensive view of witch trials, but it didn't really hold up on its own. Another reason why people think there were less witch trials in Ireland is that none of the native Irish trusted the authorities enough to be reporting each other as witches. It's very reasonable to think that nobody wanted to invite that trouble into their lives, or to be seen as colluding with the authorities. As well as the question of why there were so few trials, Ireland has an even more significant role in the history of witchcraft in Europe. It was the location of the first ever European witch trial. It took place in 1324, and naturally it involved an English woman. She was Dame Alice Lepoire, a 71-year-old Anglo-Norman noblewoman. Her maiden name was Alice Keiteller, and she wasn't born into the nobility, but she was born rich, as the only heir of the Keiteller family fortune. Alice first got married at the age of 17 to William Outlaw, who went on to be the mayor of Kilkenny. They had one son, also named William. The elder William died in 1302, leaving Alice a widow at the age of 49. She remarried the same year, though her second husband died 5 years after the wedding. Husband number 3 also only lasted 5 years before he died. Naturally, dark rumours followed her, especially because her husbands made her son William their heir. This cut their own children from previous marriages out of it, and they weren't too happy. Her fourth husband's family also didn't think much of her, but that was a class privilege. They were the nobility, and she quite definitely was not. Sir Richard Lepoire, who she married in 1316, was a baronet. The name Lepoire means the poor, and refers to the family founder taking a religious vow of poverty. But the Lepoires were very far from being poor. Power's Court in Wicklow was named after them. If you've ever been to that mansion, you'll have seen how much money was spent on creating it and its grounds. They were just as rich in 1316, and they were not impressed by the head of their family's new 63-year-old bride. It's thanks to their disdain for her that this is usually known as the Dame Alice Keiteller story, rather than using her married name. But the real victim of the story is a servant in her household called Petronilla de Meath. Petronilla, by the way, is hardly a common name these days outside of the Netherlands, but it was a bit more common back in the Middle Ages. It comes from a 1st century saint who might have been the daughter of St. Peter. De Meath just means from Meath. She wasn't rich enough to afford a surname. We don't know a lot about Petronilla de Meath, mostly because she was just a servant. This is why historians tend to pay less attention to her. It's too tempting to focus on the people we know more about. But as you'll see, this really should be considered her story. That story begins in 1324, when Sir Richard Lepoire died. His family thought this was an unnatural death and accused Alice of poisoning him. Back then, people didn't know much about poisons, and poisoning was considered a form of witchcraft. The accusations caught the ear of the Bishop Richard de la Drede. Now, at the time, the idea of putting someone on trial for witchcraft was actually kind of unusual. The church did believe in witches, of course, since they're mentioned in the Bible, but they were much less of a concern than heretics. This was before the Reformation, but there were still plenty of non-Catholic denominations, like the Albigensians, for them to go after. Another major target were Jews, who had been forced to convert to Christianity, but still practiced their own religion in secret. That was the reason why the Spanish Inquisition was set up. And it was actually a similar thing at work here. Richard de la Drede thought that there were still people in Ireland practicing Celtic Christianity, an insular form of the religion that had developed on the island before Rome reasserted its dogma. To him, this was basically the same as paganism. And if Alice was a witch, that obviously made her a pagan, so she might be linked. So he wrote to the authorities to have Alice arrested. Unfortunately for him, the Chancellor of the Ireland at the time was actually the brother of Alice's first husband and the uncle of William Jr., so he managed to stall things long enough to allow Alice to flee to England. The bishop arrested all of her servants instead, and he decided to make Petronilla the main scapegoat, possibly because she was an unwed mother. Petronilla was tortured into giving a confession, which was still legal at the time. She confessed to consorting with a demon and using magic to force Alice's husbands to sign the wills. The details of the trial were foundational in setting the template for witch trials to come. Petronilla was convicted and was burned at the stake on the 3rd of November 1324. She was the first recorded victim of a witch trial in Europe, and the first person in Ireland executed for heresy. Despite that, it's still Alice's name that is usually used to talk about the trial, since of course the noble involved is far more important than the servant. As for the bishop, he actually wound up accused of heresy himself for having held the trial, and had to go into exile for several years. Over the following centuries, witch trials became more and more common across Europe. King James VI of Scotland learned about witches in 1589, while he was in Denmark marrying his fiancée Princess Anne. Terrible storms had prevented her coming to Scotland, and more storms battered them as they came back. James was convinced that this was the work of witches, and this led to Scotland's first trials under a Witchcraft Act they had passed back in 1563. England had passed one around the same time, and Ireland passed its own in 1586. Like most laws from the Irish Parliament, it was a carbon copy of the English one. Unlike Scotland, or England once James became king, it was quite some time before Ireland's law was put into effect. In fact, the first person wasn't found guilty under it until nearly 70 years later, in 1655. And that person, a woman called Marion Fisher, was exonerated on appeal. We don't know much about that case, but we do know a lot about the second person tried under the Act, Florence Newton, the Witch of Youghal. Youghal is a seaside town in Cork. Back in 1660, it had a population of around 2,300 people. One of those people was the merchant John Pine, who was rich enough to have a nice house and a large number of servants. In late December, Florence Newton, a 65-year-old woman, came to the house to beg for food. Mary Langdon, one of the servants, told her to go away. A few weeks later, she returned while Mary was carrying a pail of water. When she was told to leave, Florence grabbed the pail and emptied it over Mary's head. Then Florence violently kissed her and told her, "Mary, let us be friends, for I bear you no ill will," in a tone that Mary took as a threat. A few days later, Mary fell ill with what people thought was demonic possession. The symptoms Mary is described as having are classic witchcraft possession symptoms: throwing fits, showing unnatural strength, vomiting up household objects, recoiling from the Bible, and poltergeist-like effects. All pretty easily faked, and similar to known tricks used by spiritualists a couple of centuries later. She claimed that the fits were her being attacked by Florence in spectral form, which led to Florence being arrested and bound in chains. Once this was done, Mary claimed that the attacks ended. The idea at the time was that iron was proof against witchcraft, so if a witch was chained, her spirit could not leave her body. While Florence was imprisoned, one of her jailers named David Jones fell ill. He was convinced that she had bewitched him, and when he died, she was charged with his murder through witchcraft. Florence stood trial on the 11th of September 1661. The charge of bewitching Mary carried a sentence of a year in jail, but the charge of killing David Jones carried the death penalty. Because of that, her prosecution was led by William Donville, the Attorney General of Ireland. While we have records of the witness statements from the trial, we don't have a record of the verdict itself. All we have is a record that Florence died, either found guilty and executed, or died while in prison. Either way, it seems clear that her death was the result of Mary's accusation. The accusation itself was one of the classic scenarios for witch trials. An elderly spinster is refused charity. She rebukes the person who refused her, and in retaliation is accused of witchcraft. The fact that this spiraled into a charge of murder shows how quickly these things can escalate. Not all witches made it to trial. In 1698, an elderly woman was murdered by a lynch mob who thought she was a witch. There are also several records of accusations being made within the Presbyterian Church and being resolved by the elders rather than going to court. Usually they seem to have punished the accuser for slander rather than the accused. It's important to remember that Presbyterians were legally almost as much outsiders as Catholics for quite some time and were blocked from holding public office until as late as 1828. Despite this, the next witch trial in the records came from that community. It took place in 1711 in Carrickfergus, just north of Belfast. This was the case of the Island Magee witches, the only mass witch trial in Ireland. To give you an idea of how important this trial is to Irish witchcraft history, over half the people who were tried under the Irish Witchcraft Act were charged in this one trial. For anyone who hasn't heard of Island Magee, first thing you should know is it's not an island. It's a peninsula in the northeast of Ireland that forms the outer edge of Loch Larne. It's one of the oldest inhabited places in the island of Ireland, with people living there 7,000 years ago. It's also the first place in Ireland that dinosaur bones were found in the 19th century. It's only 25 miles from Scotland, and you can see the far coast on a clear day. In other words, it's an uncanny place, exactly where you'd expect to hear stories of witches. The Island Magee affair began in February 1711 with the death of Anne Holtridge. Anne was the widow of John Holtridge, who had been the Presbyterian minister for Island Magee up until 1697. Anne lived with her son James, his wife, and her 2 grandchildren in Nowhead House, which had originally been built as a residence for her husband. 5 months before her death, Anne had a shocking experience when she was pelted with stones thrown in through the window of the house. When she looked outside, she didn't see anyone, but she said she felt a demonic presence. 3 months later, she and one of the servants were sitting by the kitchen fire when a mysterious boy appeared. He was around 12 years old and wore torn black clothing. At first they assumed he was a beggar who had crept in. The boy covered his face with his hand, refused to speak, and danced menacingly around the kitchen before leaping out of the window and running away. He returned a dozen times before finally leaving. That was the last they saw of him until the 12th of February, when a book of sermons Anne was reading went missing. The following morning, the boy appeared and smashed the kitchen window with the book. When a servant came to investigate, the boy taunted her, claimed the devil had taught him to read, and then committed several other acts of minor vandalism before leaving. All of this led many in the local community to think that a demon had been sent to attack the house, and that it was targeting Anne in particular. A few days later, Anne started to suffer agonizing back pains, and when she died on the 22nd, even the doubters began to think that something unnatural was happening. 5 days after Anne died, her daughter arrived in Island McGee to grieve with her family and attend the funeral. I don't know the daughter's name, but I do know who she brought with her friend Mary Dunbar. Mary came from Castlereagh. She was 18 years old, well educated for the time, and was considered to be an intelligent and honest girl. Her family might have been connected to the Dunbar family of Lisburn, who were fairly prosperous at the time. Mary had never been to Island McGee before, but it's safe to say that Island McGee would never forget her visit. On the night of her arrival, Mary found a peculiar object in the house, an apron rolled into a ball and secured with a string tied in 5 strange knots. This was considered to be a form of magic. Everyone in the house except Mary was afraid to untie the knots, in case there was a curse tied up in them. Mary untied it to reveal a cap belonging to Anne wrapped up in the apron. The following morning, the fears of a curse in the bundle seemed to come true when Mary began suffering stabbing pains and convulsions. She was confined to bed, where she screamed out, quote, "Fie, fie upon you for a wicked woman. I trust in God you shall never get advantage over me. Your master afflicted Job, but God preserved him. I believe that God who preserved him and the children of Israel in the Red Sea is able to deliver me from thee. I trust in Christ you will get your reward." End quote. In a moment of recovery, she said that she'd been talking to a woman with a dirty face who had appeared at her bedside, along with several others, all threatening to kill her. She continued to see visions of these attackers and rail against them for several days. Just like with Mary Langdon, these were classic symptoms that witches had ordered evil spirits to attack her. On the 1st of March, Mary had recovered enough to discuss her ordeal. She claimed one of the spiritual attackers had used the name Janet Carson, something which was very disturbing to Janet's daughter, who was visiting at the time. She asked the local Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Robert Sinclair, to intervene. He took Janet Carson to see the girl, but it backfired, as Mary threw another fit the moment Janet approached her room. After Janet was identified, a parade of local women were brought through Mary's room to see what would happen. She identified Janet Liston and her daughter Elizabeth Sinclair as also being among her attackers. Liston had a reputation locally for witchcraft, part because she and her daughter both suffered from lame legs. This singling out of the afflicted was common in accusations of this type. Through this, Mary continued to have fits, and public interest in the case continued to grow. The Reverend Sinclair and his Church of Ireland counterpart, the Reverend David Robb, took the case to the justice with authority over the area, Edward Clements. He was the mayor of Carrickfergus, which was the closest large town. He arrived on the 4th, in time for Mary to implicate another woman, Catherine McAlmond. Again, she picked someone with a poor reputation locally, this time for being irreligious. Other people now began to report supernatural phenomena. The Reverend Sinclair heard a horse neighing in the air above his head, for example. Much like with Mary Langdon, this had taken on a life beyond Mary Dunbar's accusations. On the 5th of March, the 4 women Mary had accused were all arrested and taken to Carrickfergus jail. Mary's symptoms abated once they were in prison, which was taken to be further evidence of their guilt. However, a few days later, she had another fit and claimed to have been attacked by two new women called Main and Latimer. Two women with those surnames in Carrickfergus were arrested. Both had the first name Janet. I don't know how common Janet was as a name, or if Mary had some aversion to it. Janet Main in particular, she said, was the leader of all the witches who had attacked her. The tests of these women, by the way, included a Bible knowledge quiz by the Reverend Sinclair and being asked to recite the Lord's Prayer perfectly. Since none of them managed this to his satisfaction, that was further proof of their guilt. Once again, Mary improved after they were in prison, but then she started throwing more fits. By this time, it was about 2 weeks since the whole ordeal had begun. This time, it was a Mistress Anne and a one-eyed woman who were attacking her. After throwing a fit during the sermon at church on Sunday, Mary was taken to Larne. In the meanwhile, a woman matching the description of the one-eyed woman was arrested. No prizes for guessing that her first name was Janet Miller. With her in jail, it was only Mistress Anne attacking Mary. Mary claimed that after attacking her, the woman turned into a spider and left the room. One witness didn't see the spirit, but did confirm he'd seen a spider leave the room. Meanwhile, No Head House was still haunted by spirits, even with Mary gone, and Mary continued to have fits that she blamed on Mistress Anne, and the authorities kept looking for the woman. Margaret Mitchell from Kilroot, north of Carrickfergus, was arrested on the 20th of March and taken to Mary, who confirmed that this was Mistress Anne. Once Margaret was in prison, Mary stopped having most of her fits, and those she had were blamed on the prisoners being let out of their manacles to exercise. The supernatural goings-on at No Head House kept up until the 31st of March, which was the day before the trial began. Just before the trial, Mary claimed that 3 new witches, who told her she wouldn't find out who they were cursing her to be unable to speak from 5 in the morning until the evening. This conveniently meant that she didn't have to testify at the trial. When the trial began, the prosecutors initially tried to argue that the witches were responsible for Anne Haltridge's death. But since that would have made this a capital trial with the death penalty, the judges refused to allow that on the docket. Mary didn't testify, but 19 other witnesses did, all for the prosecution. The 8 alleged witches had no defence witnesses and no defence lawyer either, since there was no law to provide one for them. As a result, they were at the mercy of the judges summing the case up. There were 2 judges overseeing the trial. One, Judge Anthony Upton, was an Englishman who had graduated from Oxford. He did believe in witches, but he was not convinced by the trial, so he directed the jury to acquit. The other judge was James McCartney, a Belfast man. He had the opposite opinion, and told the jury they should convict the women. The jury trusted the local man, and the 8 women were found guilty. Since this was not a capital case, the 8 women were sentenced to a year in prison. As part of their sentence, they were pilloried 4 times. This meant they were put in the stocks, where they had vegetables thrown at them. This was a more brutal sentence than it sounds, and a report written the following century claims that one of the women lost an eye from the attacks. There's no evidence of that, though it was a fairly common occurrence in pillorying. In fact, we don't know much more about what happened to these poor women after the trial. Mary Dunbar went on to accuse William Seller, Janet Liston's husband, of witchcraft, and he was convicted as well and imprisoned alongside his wife and daughter. That's the last we know about him, and the last we know about Mary Dunbar as well. The Eileen McGee case became a lot better known in Ireland back in 2014, when Martina Devlin wrote a novel about the case and suggested to the local council that they erect a memorial. A TUV councillor objected on the grounds that it could become a shrine to paganism and said that he wasn't convinced the women weren't witches. Naturally, this got a lot of coverage in the media. A plaque was eventually unveiled in 2022, although a line saying, "Today we recognise your innocence," was removed when a different councillor pointed out that they didn't have the legal authority to make that statement. From rural Eileen McGee to Dublin City, where a woman named Dorcas Kelly was hanged and then burned at the stake after her death in 1761. She was a brothel keeper who had her business in the southwest of the city on the notorious Copper Alley. The legend is that she was an associate of the infamous Hellfire Club, was framed by them for witchcraft when she became pregnant by their leader. The truth is that she wasn't convicted of witchcraft, though. She was executed for the murder of a shoemaker named John Dowling. There are stories that the police found 5 more bodies in the cellars of her brothel, This might have been made up by the newspapers. Either way, she was convicted for murder, and for that crime she was killed and then burned. After she died, the prostitutes of Copper Alley threw a wake that led to 13 arrests. She was the second last woman burned at the stake in Ireland. The last was Alice Moran, who was executed in Limerick for murder by poisoning in 1768. The last woman to be arrested for witchcraft in Ireland was Biddy Early in 1865. She was the 67-year-old herbalist and wise woman from County Clare. Biddy was well known as a healer of both people and animals, and had an extremely good reputation in the county as someone who could solve your problems. She seems to have been unusually intelligent, as people would go to her with issues as diverse as blocked wells or butter production problems, and she'd solve them for them. We don't know why she was accused of witchcraft, but somebody went to the authorities about her. 1865 was after the original Witchcraft Act had been repealed, so this was under a new law that had been used to prosecute mediums as being frauds. The case went in front of a judge in Ennis, one of the rare cases of a native Irish person being accused of witchcraft. But the result shows why that was unusual. Nobody would testify against her, and the case was dismissed. Made her famous enough that Biddy Early is still slang for a wise woman in some parts of Ireland. That was the end of the witch trials, and that's the end of our show. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in learning more about the history of Irish witch trials, especially the Island McGee case, I can recommend the book Possessed by the Devil, written by Andrew Snedden. Have a happy Halloween, and don't let the witches catch you. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.